Good morning. 5 years ago, just a few minutes ago, was of course the great Christchurch earthquake. And we note again our sympathy to the people of New Zealand and people of Christchurch for the loss they suffered then, and our unbounded admiration for the courage and resilience they showed in rebuilding that city. Of course, Christchurch was hit by an earthquake only a few weeks ago. And when I met with John Key last week, I conveyed our sympathies on that account, but also the remarkable regard that every Australian has, and I think people all around the world have, at the way in which New Zealanders responded to that shocking earthquake and the resilience and the optimism and the courage that they showed. Now, turning to matters more domestic. We will be introducing into the House today legislation that responds to the recommendations of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters into the last election. What these changes will do, what they seek to do, is to ensure that Australian voters determine where their Senate votes go, so that Australians will determine where their preferences go, transparently, clearly, accountably. At the moment, as you know, with the group voting tickets, a person who votes one for a particular party may find their preferences going, well, they won't know where they're going unless they bother to look up the group voting ticket on the AEC website. And of course, parties are entitled to register 3 group voting tickets. So there may be 3 options for where their votes may go, or perhaps a third of their vote goes in separate directions. The system has been taken advantage of. There is no doubt about that. The last Senate election was widely criticised. Australians were astonished to see people elected to the Senate whose primary votes were a fraction. In the case of one senator from Victoria, about 0.5% of the vote. So what these changes will do is ensure that above the line, voters will be invited or directed to number 6 squares, 1 to 6. If they only number 1, their vote will, or less than 6, their vote will still be formal. So, contrary to what Senator Dastyari said today, this change will not increase informal voting, quite the contrary. There are other changes made of a more technical nature to below-the-line voting, but the fundamental change is in terms of above-the-line voting, which is where the vast majority of voters do vote. They will determine, all of us, or every Australian who votes in the Senate will determine where their vote goes. And that's democracy. This is an important reform. It's been called for by all parties. The Labor Party supported the recommendations of the Joint Standing Committee. I don't think the Special Minister of State, I think, would agree that there's been no more forceful advocate of this change than Gary Gray himself, Labor's spokesman in this area. So this is an important change, it's an important reform, it's an important electoral reform, it's an important economic reform because it goes to the governance of Australia. Our strong economy, our destiny depends on the strength of our democracy. This strengthens it because it gives the power, the choice, back into the hands of voters, clearly and accountably. Matthias, did you want to add to that?
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Some 2 years ago or thereabouts, the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, in a unanimous cross-party report, a report endorsed not just by the Coalition but Labor and the Greens as well, made a series of recommendations on the way the current electoral system for the Senate could be improved. Right now, under the current system, 97% of people at the last election voted 1 above the line. That is all people across Australia can do right now when they vote in the Senate above the line. At that point, they lose control of their preference. Parties then, through insufficiently transparent group and individual voting ticket arrangements, direct what happens with people's preference. What we are wanting to do for voters is to ensure that you, the voter, determine where your preferences go. Not just your first preference, but also your second, third and fourth and subsequent preferences. through the reform that the Prime Minister has just outlined. This is a very important reform. Obviously, we are putting it to the Parliament based on consultation that has taken place over the past 2 years, and we are hopeful that the Parliament will endorse this very important reform, but that is going to be a matter for the Parliament.
Prime Minister, on informal, just on that, say you do vote 1 to 6, you go, say, the grumpy Christians number 1, and you go for the mad loonies number 2, and so on and so forth, and you've got 6 micro parties. What happens to that vote in the end? It's effectively informal, isn't it, if you're not going for any of the biggest? Is that not...
No, it's not. It's a perfectly formal vote. It's a perfectly formal vote.
But it doesn't count in the sense...
It does. Every vote counts. Well, perhaps you could...
So
Matthias
what happens in those circumstances? I mean, in the end, it's a matter for the individual voter to determine how many preferences they want to issue. The Senate ballot paper will provide guidance to if you want to vote above the line. The way to vote above the line is by numbering at least 6 boxes. Obviously, it is a matter for the voter which boxes they tick. The vote is absolutely formal, but it might well be that if they fill in 6 boxes and, as in your scenario, don't express a preference for one of the major parties, then at the end of those 6 votes, the vote is exhausted, and that is in the ordinary course of events. Sorry, but I mean, just think about the alternative. The alternative is that a political party trades those votes away in secret without actually reflecting the true intention of the voter. And what we've focused on here, taking on board what the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters has said to us unanimously, what we're trying to do here is to empower the voter to determine their preference.
If you do vote just one above the line, do your preferences just go to that party and then that's it? Or is there
That's right.
That's right.
So there's no further preference?
If you voted 1 above the line, your preferences would just go to the set candidates in that group. But of course, it would be, in reference to Andrew's question, it would be perfectly open to, if you wanted to number every single box. So, you know.
Now risk a battle with the crossbenchers, you're effectively taking them on. What if this leads to some sort of boycott in the Senate of legislation from this time up until the election?
Well, we would hope that senators crossbenchers will vote on legislation on its merits and without regard to whatever they may perceive to be their personal electoral agenda. They are, after all, elected to serve the people of the state or territory from which they're chosen, and they should act accordingly.
The strongest signal yet that you will be ready soon for an election. How quickly do you expect the legislation to pass? And have you been told by the AEC they'll be able to implement these changes if they get through?
Well, I might ask the Minister to address that.
Well, obviously, as part of our consultations on the legislation, we did consult with the ASC, and the ASC have advised us that they would require about 3 months to implement these changes between passage of the legislation and implementation at an election. The way the process will work from here is that, as the Prime Minister has indicated, we will be introducing this legislation to House of Representatives today. It will be referred for inquiry to the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters with a reporting date of 2nd of March. And we are proposing to debate this reform proposal in the Senate from the 2nd March onwards for as long as it takes.
Hang on, perhaps one to you and then to Phil. Well, nothing has changed. I'm working on the assumption that the election will be held at the normal time, which is August, September, October, in that period. I know there's been speculation about a double dissolution election. Our aim is to ensure that is to persuade the senators to pass the Registered Organisations Bill and indeed to pass the Australian Building Construction Commission legislation, or the legislation that would reinstate that. So that's why we'd urge them to do that. And I think in the light of the recommendations and the findings of the Hayden Royal Commission on trade unions, I think it's the case for that legislation is stronger than ever. Phil. Well, this is important. Our obligation, our responsibility as the government is to present important reforms. This is an important reform. It's been, as Matthias has said, it was unanimously recommended by the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. The Labor Party's own submission supported the introduction of this change, of this optional preferential voting, optional preferential voting above the line. That is what we're introducing. There has been unanimous condemnation, I suppose, of the group voting tickets and the practices associated with that by commentators and academics, business groups, right across the board. I think Australians were shocked by some of the results of the election. So we're responding to that. I would hope the Labor Party would support it. Their opposition could only be based on a very, very tactical political judgment that it didn't suit them at this time, because as a matter of principle, they have been in favour of it in the past. I'll just make this observation, and this is critically important. These changes will advantage only the voter. That's the only person that will benefit from these is the voter, because the voter will determine where their preferences go. So it's up to the voter.
Prime Minister, a briefing note distributed to colleagues today the inclusion of logos on ballot papers for the first time, and secondly said that the AEC will be running a pre-election awareness campaign to make sure that the changed arrangements are well understood. First of all, what's the thinking behind the distribution, the publication of logos, and secondly, how much are you planning on spending on this awareness campaign?
Well, so in relation to those two questions, firstly, this is actually the party logo issue. This is an issue that was canvassed by the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters at the last election. There was a level of concern around voter confusion in relation to parties with similar names. A very efficient and elegant way to deal with this is to enable political parties at their discretion to have their logo included next to their name on the ballot paper. So that proposal, I think, is self-explanatory. Now, in relation to resourcing of the Electoral Commission, in the lead-up to any election, you'd be aware that the Electoral Commission runs a series of public awareness campaigns around, encouraging people to vote, making sure that people understand that they have to vote, and various matters related to it. This would obviously happen in the lead-up to this election later this year as well, except that there will be an emphasis by the Electoral Commission as appropriate to ensure that voters properly understand the changes that have been made and why, and how that empowers them to direct their preferences in the Senate above the line according to their wishes.
Prime Minister, will the AEC need any more money to do that job? And Prime Minister, if the election had been held on the weekend, according to the latest poll today,
Well, in relation to the resourcing of the Electoral Commission, as the technical terminology is that for the Electoral Commission, elections are a demand-driven program, and obviously they get the appropriate resources for that purpose. What that means in detail, we will be working out in the next few weeks.
Yeah. Sorry, David.
You've been critical of how some senators were elected on tiny primary votes. What about their performance in the Senate over the last couple of years? You're saying this has been a bad outcome for Parliament for the nation, for 18 dozen senators?
I won't be drawn into comments on the performance of individual senators. I'd simply say that the operation of any electoral system, any voting system, should be to clearly and transparently translate the wish of the voter into a parliamentary result. The current system for voting in the Senate is anything but transparent. I mean, people can vote for a party, be a big party or a tiny party. It could be one of the micro parties, and they have no idea where their preference is going to go. And as you know, I think we all know, the so-called preference whisperers have been very adept, very ingenious in working out how to game the system, as it were, and use a range of micro parties, some of which share the same offices and are closely associated with each other, and are created purely for the purpose of harvesting preferences. So the system has been gamed, and it is simply not transparent. I mean, we believe fervently, passionately in a transparent democracy, so that you should know who you vote for And if you want to vote for a small party, fine. If you want to vote for a big party, fine. If you want to vote for a small one and preference a big one, or vice versa, fine. But you should do that transparently so that you determine where your vote goes. At the moment they are determined behind closed doors, and as I said earlier, with so many group voting tickets, sometimes you couldn't even work out where your vote was going. Chris, yeah. Well, that is, Chris, it's kind of you to invite me to comment on myself, but how could I presume to do the job of such a distinguished commentator as yourself? You can form your own conclusions, and I'm sure they'll be very eloquent.
Prime Minister, can you tell us whether you've locked down the deal with the Greens yet on the Senate voting reform? Are there any outstanding issues with the Greens, or is that all done and dusted?
Well, the proposal that is here before us reflects, firstly, the recommendations. It's our response to the recommendations of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. It's obviously based on broad consultation. In recent weeks, we've consulted with all of the parties and interested members of the Parliament. And well, that'll be a matter for the Parliament, and we won't speak for other parties. I mean, we let them speak for themselves. We are putting forward a proposal today that is based on consultation. Obviously, we would like to see the proposal we're putting forward today passed by the Parliament, but that is ultimately a matter now for the Parliament to consider.
Hang on. Wait a second. Excuse me. No, excuse me, sir. Just sorry. You're talking over the top of Lenore.
A lot of the experts I spoke to last week, who were broadly supportive of the rationale for these changes that you're making, said that they would also have the consequence of advantaging the coalition's Senate vote to some extent. Do you accept that that could be a consequence of these things, even if it's not your purpose, if your purpose is
Well, we don't have a view on that, Lenore. This is you've got to remember, look, different pundits will express different views on this. This is a reform that was recommended unanimously, as Matthias said some time ago, by the Parliamentary Committee. We're taking it up now. It needs to be done now so that it is in place before the election, whenever that election is held in the second part of this year. So this is the time has come to do this. But as to who may be better off, the truth is that the only people that will be better off are the voters, because their wish will be clearly translated into a parliamentary outcome. And surely that's what this whole mechanism, this great edifice here, is designed to translate the will of the Australian people into senators and members of the House. And that's what this will do, is make that translation more transparent and more effective. Bonge. Sorry, sorry, sir, yeah.
There were a number of recommendations made by the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters in relation to increased membership requirements and so on. Based on our consultations, we formed the view that there's no prospect of a consensus across the Parliament at this point to pursue some of these recommendations, so we won't. With the exception of one proposed change, at present, individuals can, and some individuals are, publicly registered officers for more than one party, presumably negotiating preferences with themselves. As part of these reforms, we will introduce a measure to ensure that people cannot hold relevant public office in more than one party.
Last question.
Paul. Finance Minister?
Well,
that's probably really a question for the Treasurer. I'd suggest you raise that with him. Yeah, well, the Finance Minister wishes to...
I'm focused on making sure that we spend only as much as necessary and as little as possible to ensure we don't need to increase taxes on the Australian people like Labor proposes to do. Our focus, of course, is on stronger growth, more jobs, less spending and better, more efficient, lower taxes.
Stronger growth, more jobs, fairness, those are the three key priorities, and I'm really delighted, Bonge, that you've arranged so elegantly for us to conclude the press conference on that note. Thank you very much.